She didn't cry. That was the thing nobody expected. After 10 years of building a life around a man who never truly saw her, 10 years of silent sacrifices, abandoned dreams, and swallowed pride, Claire Monroe stood in her own kitchen and watched her husband slide divorce papers across the marble counter like he was canceling a magazine subscription. And she didn't cry. She picked up the pen. She signed her name. And she walked out the door of the most beautiful prison she had ever lived in. This is the story of what happened next. Stay with me until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button. Let's begin. The kitchen smelled like fresh coffee and something rotting underneath it. Claire noticed that first, the way expensive things always managed to hide what was decaying beneath them. The apartment on the 34th floor of a building on Central Park West had floor-to-ceiling windows and Italian marble countertops and a Sub-Zero refrigerator that cost more than most people's cars. It was the kind of place that appeared in architectural magazines, the kind of place that made strangers assume the people living inside were happy. She was standing at the window when Adrian came in. She heard his footsteps, that particular measured cadence she had memorized over a decade, the sound of a man who believed the floor existed to announce his arrival. He set something down on the counter behind her. The sound was quiet, almost gentle. She turned around. The papers were in a manila folder. Clean edges. No drama. Adrian Holloway stood on the other side of the kitchen island with his jacket still on, his tie still perfectly knotted, looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not cruelty. Not anger. Something worse. Relief. "I think we've both known for a while," he said. Claire looked at the folder. She looked at him. "Have we?" It wasn't a question. She didn't know why she said it that way. Her voice came out flat, like a woman reading a grocery list, and she watched something flicker across Adrian's face. Surprise, maybe, or disappointment that she wasn't going to perform the scene he had rehearsed in his head. "Vivienne is back," he said. "She's been back for 3 months." 3 months. Claire let that number sit in the room between them. She had wondered, of course. She had noticed things. The later evenings, the way his phone screen tilted away from her whenever she walked past. The particular kind of careful distance that only exists between people who are hiding something. She had noticed and said nothing because she had learned a long time ago that naming a thing gave Adrian permission to make it her fault. "How long were you going to wait?" she asked. "I wanted to handle it cleanly." "Handle it?" She repeated his words back to him, the way she used to do with unresponsive patients. Flat, precise, watching for a reaction. "You wanted to handle your marriage cleanly." "Claire, don't." She held up one hand. Her fingers were steady. She noticed that. She had expected them to shake, and they didn't, and the steadiness of her own hand felt like a stranger standing in her kitchen. "Don't make a speech. You've already decided. You walked in here with the papers already drawn up." "That's not a conversation, Adrian. That's a notification." He had the decency to look away. She walked to the counter. She picked up the folder and opened it, and she read every page. Not quickly, not as a performance, but actually read it. The way she used to read patient charts when she was Dr. Claire Monroe, the trauma physician who had once rebuilt a man's aorta with her bare hands in a Level 1 facility in New Haven, while residents twice her confidence stood against the wall and watched. She read carefully. She checked the asset division, the property agreements, the neat legal language that reduced 10 years of a human life to numbered paragraphs. Then she picked up his pen from the counter where he had left it beside the folder, because of course he had left the pen, and she signed every page. Adrian watched her in silence. She capped the pen. She set it down. She pushed the folder back across the marble toward him and met his eyes for the first time since he had walked in. "You should know," she said quietly. "I'm not going to fall apart. I know that's what you're afraid of. I don't think... You've spent 10 years waiting for me to fall apart, Adrian. Every argument we ever had, you always ended it the same way. You'd go quiet and wait for me to cry first, and then you'd use it. That's over." She picked up her coffee cup from the counter. It had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but she didn't care. And she looked at him with a steadiness that seemed to cost her nothing. "I hope she makes you happy. I mean that. Now please leave." He left. She stood in the kitchen alone for a long time after the front door clicked shut. The coffee was terrible. The apartment was immaculate and silent and worth $4 million. And she stood in the middle of it in the morning light coming off Central Park, and tried to locate some feeling inside her chest that resembled grief. She found something, but it wasn't what she expected. It felt almost like exhaling. She hadn't cried in the kitchen. She made it all the way to the bathroom before her legs stopped cooperating. Not crying. She needed to be clear about that, even to herself, because the distinction mattered. What happened in the bathroom was something different. She sat down on the cold tile floor with her back against the cabinet and her knees pulled up, and she breathed, in and out, slow and deliberate, the way she had once coached trauma patients through shock. Stay with me. Just breathe, one breath at a time. She coached herself through it the same way, because there was nobody else in the apartment to do it, and after a few minutes, the tightness in her chest loosened just enough. She looked at her hands. They were still steady. She hated them for it, a little. It would have been easier if they shook. She pulled her phone out of her pocket and called the only person she had left. Dana picked up on the second ring. "He served me," Claire said. No preamble, no softening, silence. Then, "I'm coming over." "You don't have to, Claire." Dana's voice was quiet and immovable, the tone of a woman who had been this person's best friend for 22 years and had absolutely no patience for self-protective deflection at 8 in the morning. "Stop talking. I'm coming." She came. She arrived 40 minutes later with 2 cups of proper coffee from the place on Columbus that Claire had always liked before Adrian convinced her the neighborhood was becoming too crowded. And she sat down on the kitchen floor beside Claire without saying anything immediately, because Dana Reyes had always understood that some silences needed to be inhabited before they could be broken. They sat there together on the marble tile. "Was it Vivienne?" Dana finally asked. "Yes." "How long?" "3 months, he said." Dana made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and stared at the sub-zero refrigerator across from them with an expression of pure, quiet fury that she was thoughtful enough not to perform out loud. "I signed the papers," Claire said. "Good. Everyone's going to think I couldn't hold my marriage together. Everyone who matters thinks Adrian Holloway has always been a carefully dressed problem." Dana turned her head and looked at Claire directly. Her eyes were dark and sharp and full of something that wasn't pity. It was closer to old anger, the kind that accumulates over years of watching someone you love shrink to fit inside someone else's idea of who they should be. "Can I say the thing I've been not saying for 8 years? If you have to." "You stopped being a doctor for him." Claire said nothing. "You were the most frighteningly good trauma physician I had ever seen in my life," Dana continued. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You could have gone anywhere. Hopkins was recruiting you. That fellowship in Chicago—" "Dana, I'm not doing it to hurt you. I'm doing it because you need to hear the actual size of what you gave up, and you never let anyone say it." She reached over and put her hand on Claire's wrist, not squeezing, just resting there. "He made you feel like your ambition was a problem, like wanting things for yourself was somehow aggressive. And you were so in love with him that you decided he was probably right, and you got smaller and smaller and—" "Stop!" Claire's voice cracked on the word. Just once. She pressed her lips together and breathed through it. "I know, okay? I know." "What do you want?" Dana asked. "Not what you're supposed to want. Not the graceful recovery arc. What do you actually want?" The question sat in the room between them like something heavy. What did she want? She was 41 years old. She had spent 10 years being Mrs. Adrian Holloway, attending galas and charity boards and sitting in the second chair at every dinner party while her husband worked the room. She had been good at it. She had been so good at it that some mornings she woke up and couldn't remember what her own hands used to do. "I want my brain back," she said quietly. "I want to go into a room full of things going wrong and be the person who knows what to do." Dana was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I got an email last week. I wasn't going to tell you until things settled, but—" She paused. "Dr. Kerrigan at Arctic Reach Medical. He's recruiting emergency physicians for their trauma program in Alaska. Bethel region, some of the most medically underserved territory in the country. He sent me a name to pass along, and the name was yours." Claire looked at her. "I haven't practiced in 4 years." "I know. I'd need full recertification. Trauma protocols have changed. I'm not current on half the equipment updates." "I know." "Dana, I'd be starting over completely." "I know that too." Dana held her gaze. "Do you want the number or not?" The apartment sold in 11 days. Claire let Adrian keep almost everything. Not because she was resigned to it, but because she looked at the marble countertops and the architectural lighting and the $4,000 sofa and felt nothing for any of it. She packed 3 bags. She took her medical textbooks, still stored in the walk-in closet where Adrian had once suggested they put them since the study was for his work, and she took the photograph that sat on her nightstand, her mother behind the wheel of an old blue Corolla, laughing at something outside the frame, the last photograph taken before the accident that killed her parents, and her brother on a Tuesday evening in October 19 years ago, when Claire was 22 and everything ended and everything else began. She stayed at Dana's spare room and recertified in 60 days instead of 90. That was not a gentle process. She woke up at 4:30 every morning and sat at Dana's kitchen table with her materials and her coffee and rebuilt herself from the inside out. A TLS protocols, trauma imaging updates, critical care pharmacology changes, mass casualty triage restructures. She took the certification exams and passed them and sat in her car outside the testing center and said nothing, alone, until the shaking in her hands became impossible to ignore and she finally let herself cry. Properly. Ugly and inconvenient and long overdue. Not for Adrian, not for the apartment, for the years, for the version of herself she had quietly agreed to bury because someone she loved had needed her to be smaller. She booked her flight to Alaska on a Thursday afternoon and told nobody except Donna. She landed in Anchorage in a February that had no interest whatsoever in being gentle. The cold hit her when she stepped outside the terminal, and it was not the polite cold of a New York winter. It was physical, absolute, the kind of cold that grabs your face and reminds you immediately that you are a biological creature with serious limitations. Her luggage included gear she had ordered online because she didn't own anything appropriate, and she stood on the curb outside Anchorage Ted Stevens with her 3 bags and the wrong kind of boots, and the particular look of a person who has made an enormous decision and is currently renegotiating with it. A truck pulled up, dark green, battered along the passenger side in a way that suggested encounters with things more indifferent than accidents. The window came down. Monroe? The man behind the wheel was somewhere in his early 40s, with the kind of face that had spent too much time in difficult weather and was completely indifferent to what that had done to it. Dark eyes. A jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. He was looking at her gear with an expression she recognized as someone professionally suppressing a reaction. "You're Mercer," she said. It wasn't a question. "Your boots are wrong," he said. "I know. You'll lose 2 toes in those before March. Thank you for the information." She picked up her bags. "Are you going to help or just observe?" He got out of the truck. He took the heaviest bag without asking and threw it in the truck bed, and she noticed the efficiency of the movement. No wasted energy, no performance. He moved like someone who had long ago stopped doing anything for effect. He went around to the driver's side while she handled her own remaining bags, and when she got in the cab, she found the heat going and an extra pair of proper cold weather gloves sitting on the passenger seat. No comment, no explanation. She put them on. They drove for a long time before he spoke. Outside, the landscape was vast and indifferent and more beautiful than she had expected, in the specific way that things are beautiful when they have no intention of caring whether you find them so. "You haven't practiced in 4 years," he said. Not accusatory, flat. "Correct." "When were you last on a trauma team?" "Johns Hopkins affiliate, New Haven, 14-hour shift, 3 MV as, and a penetrating chest wound." She kept her eyes on the road. "I was good at it." "Were," he said. The words sat between them. "Yes," she said. "Were, past tense. That's why I'm here." He said nothing for a moment. The truck hit a roughness in the road, and neither of them reacted to it. "We run 3 to 4 medical emergencies per week," he said. "Cardiac events, severe trauma, severe hypothermia, childbirth complications in the field. We operate with limited imaging, limited blood supply, and weather that will cancel your evacuation window without notice." He glanced at her briefly. "You're not going to be eased in." "I don't need to be eased in." "Good, because I can't afford to babysit a physician who's rebuilding her confidence while someone is bleeding on my floor." It was the most direct thing anyone had said to her in 4 years. She breathed slowly. "I need 3 weeks," she said. "Give me 3 weeks to get back up to speed on your specific protocols, your equipment, your patient population. 3 weeks. After that, I want full autonomy on my cases." "You want full autonomy?" "I'm not asking for it as a favor. I'm telling you what I'll need to be useful." She turned and met his eyes for the first time since getting in the truck. "You recruited me, Dr. Mercer. You already know what I'm capable of. Otherwise, you wouldn't have done it." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect, Not yet. Something that preceded it. 3 weeks, he said. Don't make me regret it. The truck drove on into the white. 3 weeks became 6 days. On day 4, she was working inventory in the equipment bay when the radio went off. Snowmobile accident 12 miles northeast, male in his 30s, suspected femoral fracture and possible internal bleeding, weather window closing in 40 minutes. The physician on rotation was Dr. Paulson, who was currently 6 miles out on a welfare check that couldn't wait. Mercer looked across the room at her. She was already moving. She worked the case with her hands and her instincts, and 4 years of rust burning off in real time. The patient was hypothermic and going into shock, and the nearest surgical facility was 90 minutes away by helicopter if the weather held. She made decisions fast, each one a small act of commitment, betting everything on what her hands remembered and what her mind had rebuilt in 60 days of 4:30 mornings. When they loaded the patient into the helicopter, stable, his vitals holding, Mercer came to stand beside her. She was breathing hard. Her hands were cold. There was blood on her jacket from a vascular line she'd had to recite twice because the patient was contracted from cold. That was adequate, Mercer said. She looked at him. That was excellent, she said. Say what you mean. He held her gaze for a moment. That was excellent, he said quietly. She turned back to the landing pad and watched the helicopter lift. The cold was savage, and the wind was tearing at her hair, and the sky above was the heavy gray of something building, and she stood there feeling the full weight of what had just happened. Not the case, but the person who had done it. The doctor. The woman who had signed divorce papers on a Tuesday morning and flown to the end of the world to find out if she was still alive inside. She was. She was still there, but she didn't know yet what Mercer was about to tell her in the coming weeks. A story from 19 years ago, a car crash, a teenage boy who stayed when everyone else had gone, a truth that would make her question whether any of this had actually been chance at all. The helicopter disappeared into gray sky, and then there was only wind. Claire stood on the landing pad for longer than was necessary. Her jacket was stiff where the blood had begun to freeze at the cuff, and her fingers inside the borrowed gloves had gone from numb to burning in the way that meant circulation was fighting to return. She didn't move. She stood there with the cold hammering at the side of her face, and she let herself feel the full length of the last 40 minutes. Not analyze it, not dissect it for errors, just feel it the way you feel something you have been starving for and suddenly been given. She had forgotten what it felt like to be necessary. Not decorative, not convenient, not the extension of someone else's social architecture. Necessary, the specific, irreplaceable necessity of being the person in the room who knows what to do when the knowing matters in the most absolute sense possible. Mercer's footsteps crunched behind her and then stopped. Come inside, he said. Weather's moving faster than projected. She turned. He was already walking back toward the facility entrance, not waiting for her to follow, not checking over his shoulder. She noticed that. The way he issued statements instead of requests. The way he assumed the world would arrange itself sensibly around the information he provided. It should have been irritating. Somehow, it wasn't. She followed him in. The Arctic Reach facility in the Bethel region was not what television made people imagine when they thought about remote Alaskan medicine. It was not picturesque. It was a squat, heavily insulated building complex that had been expanded and re-expanded over 15 years in a way that showed every addition as a scar, different paint shades, different flooring materials, doorways that were either too narrow or too wide for the spaces they connected. It smelled like antiseptic and machine oil, and the particular flatness of recycled indoor air during a long winter. It was utilitarian in a way that was almost aggressive. Claire had decided on day 2 that she loved it. She peeled off her jacket in the equipment bay and hung it near the heating vent to let the blood stain dry before she dealt with it. Behind her, she could hear the rest of the small medical team moving through their post-response routines. Nurse practitioner Sandra Cho restocking the crash cart with the focused quiet of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Paramedic Luis Vega logging the case report at the side desk with his feet up and his pen moving fast, Doctor. Paulson's voice coming in over the radio from his welfare check saying he was 20 minutes out. Mercer came through the connecting door from the main corridor and stopped when he saw her working on her jacket at the vent. Leave it, he said. Cho will send it to laundry. I do my own laundry. Not here you don't. Biosafety protocol. Everything with patient contact goes through the facility process. He crossed to the medication cabinet and began checking stock levels, his back half turned to her. You know that. It's in the orientation binder. I didn't read the orientation binder. He stopped checking stock. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to communicate something before he resumed. Why? Because orientation binders are written for people who haven't done the job. I've done the job. You hadn't done this job. The principles don't change. He turned around. He leaned against the medication cabinet with his arms crossed and looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of patience, a held-back version of something sharper, controlled by a deliberate act of will. You recited that IV line twice. Patient was vasoconstricted from hypothermia. That's a technique issue, not a knowledge issue. I'd have done it once if his veins were cooperating. You went IO on the second attempt. Intraosseous was faster and safer given the time window. Correct call. I know it was a correct call, he said. I'm not criticizing the call. She waited. I'm telling you, he said more slowly, that you made 2 decisions in 40 minutes that were outside standard protocol for initial response, and both of them were right, and if they'd been wrong, you'd have lost the patient. He uncrossed his arms. I need to know if that's how you operate routinely or if you were compensating for rust. The question was fair. She hated that it was fair. Both, she said. He nodded once. Okay. Okay, she repeated. That's it? You told me to say what I mean. Okay. I can work with a physician who operates outside protocol if she can defend every deviation in real time. I can't work with one who can't. He pushed off from the cabinet. Can you? Ask me in 6 weeks. I'm asking you now. She held his gaze. Yes. I can defend every deviation, every single one. Something settled in the room. Not warmth exactly. Something more like 2 people establishing the actual terms of the place they were in together, which was more useful than warmth. Get some sleep, he said. We have a prenatal check in the Akia check area tomorrow, and the woman is 36 weeks, twins, blood pressure history that I don't like. He moved toward the door. I want you on it. Why me? He paused at the door without turning. Because Paulson's good with cardiac and chose the best NP in the region, but neither of them has your OB-adjacent trauma background. He did turn then, briefly. And because you need case volume. You know you do. He left. She stood in the equipment bay alone and breathed through the awareness that he was correct, that she did need case volume, that she was a person with excellent instincts currently operating on a partially rebuilt foundation, and that he had assessed all of it clearly without making her feel reduced by the assessment. That was a new experience. Paulson arrived back 22 minutes later, blowing cold off his coat in the doorway, and the look he gave Claire when she passed him in the corridor was the look she had been expecting since she arrived, the particular look that certain male physicians give female physicians who are newer to a space, a look that contains evaluation and skepticism in proportions that depend entirely on the insecurity of the person doing the looking. Dr. Gerald Paulson was 53, licensed in Alaska for 19 years, and had strong opinions about most things that he expressed as institutional knowledge. He was competent. He was also, Claire had determined within 48 hours, the specific kind of competent that becomes dangerous over time because it stops questioning itself. Heard you ran the snowmobile case, he said. I did. How'd it go? Patient stable. Femoral fracture confirmed, probable splenic contusion, flew to Fairbanks for imaging and surgery consult. Intraosseous line, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Vasoconstriction made peripheral access inadequate in the time window. IO is a last resort. IO is the correct resort when peripheral access fails and the patient is circling the drain. She said it without heat, which she knew would bother him more than if she'd snapped. Was there a clinical question you wanted to discuss, Gerald? Or is this a different kind of conversation? His jaw tightened. You've been here 2 weeks. I'm aware. There are protocols here that exist because of 15 years of learning what works in this specific environment with these specific resources and this specific patient population. Showing up from a hospital system in Connecticut and improvising on your 4th day isn't New Haven, she said. He stopped. It was New Haven, not Connecticut generally, Johns Hopkins affiliate, Level 1 Trauma Center. She kept her voice even. And I didn't improvise. I made a non-standard intervention that was clinically indicated and correctly executed. There's a difference. She took one step closer, not aggressive, just removing the comfortable distance. I understand you've been here a long time, Gerald. I respect that. But don't confuse tenure with infallibility. They're different things. She walked past him. Behind her, she heard him exhale. The particular kind of exhale that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite surrender, and was mostly a man recalibrating faster than he wanted to. Sandra Cho found Claire in the small staff common room that night at 11:15, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold and a piece of correspondence she'd been holding without reading for 10 minutes. "He's not a bad doctor," Sandra said, meaning Paulson, pouring herself coffee from the machine in the corner that made coffee approximately as good as motor oil and was beloved by the entire staff for reasons nobody had adequately explained. "I know," Claire said. "He had a bad outcome last spring. Patient with atypical MY presentation that he missed because it didn't fit the pattern he expected. Patient survived, but it was close." Sandra sat down across from her with the motor oil coffee and wrapped both hands around the mug. "He's been rigid ever since. Rigidity makes him feel safe. Rigidity gets people killed." "Yes." Sandra sipped her coffee. "He knows that too. That's the problem." She looked at Claire steadily. Sandra Cho was 38, Vietnamese American, from Anchorage originally, and had the eyes of someone who had seen enough complicated human behavior to be entirely undramatic about it. Claire had decided on day 3 that Sandra was the most competent person in the building, and she had not revised that assessment. "Can I ask you something directly?" "Go ahead." "Why Alaska?" Claire looked at her. "I know the official version," Sandra said. "Returning to practice, Dr. Kerrigan's recruitment, medically underserved region. I mean, why Alaska? Why the hardest version of coming back you could possibly choose?" Claire was quiet for a moment. The building creaked in the wind the way it did at night, a sound she had initially found alarming and now found oddly companionable. "Because I needed it to be hard," she said. "If I'd gone back to a hospital system in a city, New Haven, Chicago, doesn't matter, there would have been too much comfort available. People who remembered who I was. Institutional infrastructure to lean on." She looked at the cold tea. "I needed to find out if I still existed without any of that. Without the name, without the network, without—" She stopped. "Without any of the scaffolding." Sandra nodded slowly. "And?" "Ask me in another month." Sandra smiled, brief, honest, not performed. "Mercer thinks you're good. He told me I was adequate." "Mercer telling you that you were adequate is Mercer thinking you're good." She stood, taking her terrible coffee. "He told Paulson he was adequate on Paulson's 3rd year. He told me I was adequate the day I arrived, and never said it again because he didn't need to." She paused at the common room door. "He doesn't waste words. Learn to read the ones he uses." She left. Claire sat alone with the cold tea and the unread correspondence and the wind working at the walls, and she thought about what it meant to be read accurately by someone who had no interest in softening what they saw. The Akiachak prenatal case the next morning was a 40-minute flight in a bush plane that handled the turbulence with the indifferent brutality of a vehicle that had long stopped caring about passenger comfort. Claire sat across from Mercer in the small cabin and reviewed the patient file on a tablet while the plane shuddered through wind shear and he drank black coffee from a thermos without spilling any of it, which she found quietly impressive. The patient was Mary Tunachuk, 31 years old, Yup Ik, 36 weeks with diamniotic dichorionic twins, blood pressure reading of 148/96 at her last community health aid visit, 2+ protein on dipstick. Claire read it twice and felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the altitude. "She's preeclamptic," she said. "Likely. How long since her last clinical evaluation?" 3 weeks. Community health aide does what she can. She's not a physician. Who was managing this pregnancy? Regional hospital in Bethel. Fly-in prenatal clinic, quarterly. He looked at her over the thermos. Nearest obstetric surgeon is 90 minutes by helicopter in good weather. What's the weather forecast for today? He looked out the window. Adequate. For now. She closed the file. If her pressure is above 150 on arrival and she has any neurological symptoms, she needs to be evacuated today. Not tomorrow. Today. I know. I want to say it explicitly before we land so we're aligned. We're aligned, he said, without irritation, which she appreciated. Mary Tunachuk lived in a house that was warm and slightly crowded with 3 children under 8 and a husband named Peter, who had the look of a man who had been frightened for several weeks and was managing it through extreme practical competence. Firewood stacked, kids fed, floor swept, every surface as controlled as the rest of his situation was not. He shook both their hands at the door and said, She's been having headaches. And Claire and Mercer exchanged a look over his shoulder that communicated the same thing simultaneously and required no words. Mary was on the couch with her feet elevated. She was small and very still in the way of someone managing significant discomfort through deliberate immobility. When Claire sat beside her and took her blood pressure, the number was 162/104, and Claire kept her face calm and her voice steady and her hands moving efficiently because the worst thing you can do for a frightened patient is give them your own fear to carry on top of theirs. "Mary," she said, "I'm going to ask you some questions and I need honest answers. Have you had any visual changes? Blurring, floaters, anything like that?" "Some blurring, yesterday and this morning." "Headache?" "Since yesterday afternoon." "Any pain here?" She pressed gently on the right upper quadrant. Mary winced. Claire stood up. She looked at Mercer across the room. He was already on the radio. What followed was controlled chaos of the specific variety that exists only in field medicine, the kind where every action is precise and the environment refuses to cooperate, and the margin between adequate and insufficient is measured in minutes. They stabilized Mary, administered magnesium sulfate from their field kit with dosing that Claire calculated twice in her head and once on paper, established IV access, and monitored fetal heart tones with the portable Doppler, while Peter Tunichuk sat in the kitchen doorway with his 3 children arranged around him like he was physically trying to be a wall between them and what was happening. Twin A had a heart rate of 142. Acceptable. Twin B was 118 and decelerating. Mercer. Her voice was quiet, not alarmed, precise. He heard the precision. He crossed the room and listened to the Doppler output, and she watched his face do the same thing hers had done. Stay controlled while the brain behind it accelerated. "How long on the evacuation window?" she said. "Bird is 20 minutes out. Weather's holding. Twin B is showing late decelerations. If she delivers in the field, she's not delivering in the field." "I know she's not. I'm telling you what I'll need if she does." She was already going through the field bag with one hand. "Neonatal resuscitation equipment, what do we have?" "Bag valve mask, bulb suction, 2 preemie laryngoscope blades, size 0 ET tubes." He was beside her at the bag, both of them moving through it with the efficiency of a conversation that doesn't need to be spoken. "Warmed blankets are in the secondary kit." "Okay," she breathed. "Okay, we're not there yet. Let's not get there." They didn't get there. The helicopter arrived in 19 minutes, and the crew was good, and Mary was loaded with 2 stable fetal heart rates. Twin B had recovered to 134 after position change and oxygen. And Peter Tunichuk gripped Claire's hand at the door of the house while his children pressed against his legs and said nothing, just held on for a moment with the grip of a man who understood what the alternative to that helicopter looked like. She gripped back. On the flight home, the plane was quieter than it had been going out. The turbulence had settled into something more rhythmic, almost tolerable. Claire leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes and let the adrenaline drain out of her the slow, unpleasant way it always did. Not relief exactly, more like the feeling of a rope that has been pulled taut for a long time finally going slack, which sounds like comfort but actually just feels like exhaustion. "You were good today," Mercer said. She opened her eyes. He was looking out the window, not at her. His profile against the white sky outside was unreadable in the way of people who have trained themselves to keep their interior weather off their face. But she had been watching him for 2 weeks now, and she was beginning to learn the difference between his neutral and his actual. This was his actual. "Thank you," she said. She meant it without ceremony. "The magnesium dosing. You calculated it twice." "I always calculate it twice." "You also asked me what the evacuation window was before I'd finished registering the fetal deceleration." "I was already thinking 2 steps ahead." "Yes." He looked at her then, briefly. "That's not a criticism." She studied his face. "What is it?" "An observation." He looked back out the window. A pause that lasted long enough that she thought he was done, and then he said, "Most physicians panic forward. They move fast toward the most obvious intervention. You moved laterally. You were thinking about failure modes before the primary problem was resolved. That's how trauma medicine works. That's how good trauma medicine works." He turned the thermos in his hands. Empty, now. "Paulson panics forward. He's been doing it longer since the MI case last year. Sandra told me about that." "Of course she did." There was something almost wry in his voice. "Did she also tell you that he requested I send him to a continuing education refresher in Anchorage 3 weeks after it happened, on his own time, at his own expense?" She hadn't heard that. He's not a bad doctor, Mercer said. Exactly what Sandra had said, in the same flat tone of someone stating a thing that is important to be accurate about. He's a frightened one. There's a difference. She looked at him for a moment. You make a lot of distinctions like that, between things that seem similar but aren't. He shrugged minimally. Medicine requires it. Most people don't do it outside medicine. I do. She believed him. She looked back out her own window at the white expanse below, the sheer, overwhelming scale of the landscape, the way it made everything human seem precisely, accurately small. And she felt something loosen further inside her chest. Not the adrenaline this time, something older than that. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask. Why did you specifically request me? Not just an ER physician with my background. Me, specifically. The plane hummed. Outside, the white went on. Kerrigan sent me your name, he said. Kerrigan got my name from Dana Reyes. Dana got the contact from somewhere. That chain started somewhere, and I want to know where. He was quiet. Mercer. I saw your name on a paper, he said finally. A trauma outcomes study from 2018. New Haven cohort, penetrating abdominal trauma. Non-operative management protocols. You were lead author. He paused. The methodology was unusually sound. She waited. That wasn't the whole answer, and they both knew it. He set the thermos down on the seat between them and rubbed one hand over his jaw and stared at the floor of the plane for a moment in a way she had not seen him do before. It was the look of a man deciding something. There was a car accident, he said. October, 19 years ago. Route 14, outside of... The plane lurched hard to the left. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, clipped and immediate. We've got icing on the left wing and a pressure drop. Holding pattern, beginning emergency descent, everyone secure. Claire grabbed the seat rail. Mercer's hand came out automatically and braced against the bulkhead. The plane dropped 200 feet in 3 seconds, and the world outside the window went from white sky to white ground with alarming speed. And Claire sat with her heart slamming and her eyes open and her hands gripping cold metal while she stared at the side of Rowan Mercer's face and thought about the unfinished sentence hanging in the pressurized air between them. The name of a road she knew, a month she knew, a year that lived in her body like scar tissue. And the words he had started to say opened something in her chest that she did not yet have the context to close. The plane landed hard, not a crash. A controlled emergency landing on a gravel strip outside a village called Tuluksak that the pilot found through a gap in the cloud ceiling with the particular focus of someone who has done terrifying things enough times to do them without visibly terrifying other people. The left wing had iced enough to make the aircraft want to roll, and the pilot had fought it down with the steady, economical movements of a man having an argument he intended to win. And they hit the gravel at an angle that rattled every bolt in the fuselage. And then they were down and stopped, and the engine noise dropped to nothing, and the wind outside replaced it immediately. Nobody spoke for a moment. Claire became aware that her right hand was still gripping the seat rail, and her left hand had at some point grabbed Mercer's forearm, and she released both simultaneously, and neither of them mentioned it. Everyone intact, the pilot called back. His name was Frank Dillard, 61, 17,000 flight hours in Alaska, and his voice was the same as it always was, which was the voice of a man for whom the word rattled applied to bolts and not to himself. Yes, Mercer said. We're going to be on the ground minimum 2 hours. I've got to get the wing de-iced, and I want to check the pressure sensor before we go back up. Understood. Mercer was already unbuckling. He moved to the small cargo area at the back and began checking the medical equipment for damage from the landing impact, his hands going through each case with automatic efficiency. Claire watched him for a moment, the way his shoulders sat, slightly lower than they had been during the descent, the specific quality of the silence he was maintaining, and then she got up and helped him check the kit. They worked side by side in the narrow space without speaking. Outside, Frank was already on the wing with de-icing equipment from the storage compartment, moving in the cold with the patient competence of a man who had a job and intended to do it. After several minutes, Mercer said, "Nothing damaged." Good. She latched the last case. She straightened up, and they were close together in the narrow cargo space, and there was nowhere to redirect the conversation that had been interrupted 60 feet above the ground. She could feel it sitting between them the way the cold sat outside. Present, patient, not going anywhere. Route 14, she said. October, 19 years ago. He looked at her. His face did the thing she had been learning to read. The controlled surface, and beneath it, something that had been waiting a long time to be said and wasn't sure yet what saying it would cost. "You were in that accident," he said. It was not a question. The air in the small plane went very still. "My parents," she said carefully, "and my brother, Marcus. He was 19. She kept her voice level the way she had kept it level for 19 years, the way you keep something level when you have decided that the alternative is a direction you cannot afford to travel. "They didn't survive. I did. I was in the back seat, and I had a fractured clavicle and a grade 2 liver laceration and a concussion that I didn't know was a concussion until 3 days later." She breathed. "I was on the side of the road for 45 minutes before the ambulance arrived. There was a boy, a teenager. He stayed with me the entire time. He talked to me. He wouldn't let me close my eyes." She paused. "I never knew his name." Mercer's jaw moved once. His eyes didn't leave her face. "I was 17, he said. "I was a junior volunteer with the County Emergency Response Auxiliary. We were running a training exercise on Route 12 when the call came in." He stopped. He looked at the floor of the plane for a moment and then back at her. "You kept asking me to tell you something. Anything. You said the silence was too loud." Claire's throat closed. "I told you about the time I fell out of a fishing boat on Skillack Lake when I was 12, he said quietly. "And how the water was so cold it felt like being grabbed by something, and how I decided while I was in the water that being grabbed wasn't the same as being held under, and that as long as I could tell the difference, I was going to be fine." He stopped again. "You laughed. You actually laughed. You had a fractured collarbone and a lacerated liver, and your family was gone, and you laughed at a stupid story about a fishing boat. And I remember thinking that whoever you were going to be harder to kill than anything that had touched you." The wind hit the fuselage from the outside, a long, pressing sound. Claire sat down on the cargo crate behind her because her legs made that decision before she did. She sat, and she put both hands flat on her thighs, and she breathed through what was happening inside her chest, which was not grief exactly. It was something more structural than grief, more like a wall she had built a long time ago, developing a crack that ran from the foundation to the top in one clean line. "You became a doctor because of that night," she said. "Yes. So did I." They looked at each other across the narrow interior of a grounded bush plane in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. And the thing that passed between them in that look was not romantic and not simple and not any one emotion that had a clean name. It was the specific vertigo of discovering that the shape of your entire life was connected to another person's by a single night that neither of you had ever stopped carrying. "You found me," she said. Her voice was almost flat. Almost. "You requested me specifically. You knew." "I suspected," he said. "The name, the age, the New Haven connection. You went to Yale for medical school, and I knew you were from that region. I wasn't certain. But you suspected for long enough to engineer recruitment." "I didn't engineer anything. I told Kerrigan I wanted a trauma physician with your specific background. What he did with that information, Rowan." She said his first name for the first time since she'd arrived, and the plainness of it stopped him mid-sentence. Don't make it smaller than it is. You wanted to find me." He was quiet. "Why?" she asked. The question sat in the plane between them like something that had been traveling a very long distance and had finally arrived and was not particularly interested in being deflected. "Because I've spent 19 years wondering if you were okay," he said. "That's the honest answer. It's not complicated and it's not sinister. I stayed with you for 45 minutes on a road in October, and then the ambulance came and you were gone, and I was 17 years old and I didn't even know your last name." He crossed his arms, not defensively, more like a man bracing something internal. "I went into emergency medicine because of that night. I wanted to be the person who showed up. I've been the person who showed up for 19 years. And I always—" He stopped. He looked away. "I always wondered if the girl on Route 14 made it." The crack in the wall inside Claire's chest widened 1 more millimeter. She should say something. She was aware she should say something, and that whatever she said would matter in a way that words didn't usually matter. And she was also aware that she was not currently capable of saying anything that met that standard. So she said nothing, and Mercer seemed to understand this and didn't press it. And outside, Frank Dillard worked on the wing with steady, indifferent competence, and the wind pressed against the fuselage. And the two of them sat in the grounded plane with the full weight of 19 years rearranging itself around them. They were back in Bethel by evening. Neither of them spoke about it again that night, which was a decision made without discussion and honored by both of them with the particular discipline of two people who understand that some things need to be metabolized before they can be handled. Claire went to her quarters and sat on the edge of her bunk and held the photograph of her mother in the blue Corolla for a long time. Just held it. Didn't analyze what had happened or construct a framework around it or decide what it meant. Just sat with it the way you sometimes have to sit with something enormous and shapeless before it becomes a thing you can carry. She slept badly. She didn't expect to sleep well. At 2 in the morning, her pager went off. The case was a 44-year-old man named Carl Begich, flown in from a fishing camp 40 miles northwest. Chainsaw laceration to the left forearm and hand, deep enough that the camp medic on the radio had described tendons with the specific horrified clarity of someone who had never seen tendons before and would prefer never to see them again. Blood loss estimated significant. ETA 11 minutes. Claire was in the trauma bay before the helicopter landed. Gloves on, tray set, the particular focused blankness descending over her that she had once thought she'd lost permanently and had apparently only mislaid. Sandra was beside her checking airway equipment. Paulson came in 2 minutes later from the sleeping quarters, hair flattened on one side, and stopped when he saw Claire already positioned at the primary. She felt him stop. She didn't turn around. "I've got primary," she said, a pause that lasted too long. "I'm the attending on call tonight." "You are. And I'm telling you, I've got primary on this one." She kept her eyes on the door. "If you want to scrub in as secondary, I'll brief you on what I need." The pause again, different quality this time. "Okay," he said, and he scrubbed in as secondary, and she felt the size of what that cost him and silently acknowledged it without turning it into anything more than it was. Carl Begich arrived with the look of a man who had made several attempts to be stoic about the situation and was losing the argument with his own nervous system. The laceration was worse than the radio description. The chainsaw had caught him at an angle that opened the volar forearm from mid-shaft to the wrist, partial transection of flexor digitorum, superficialis, deep laceration involving the median nerve sheath that she couldn't fully assess until she got better visualization, and 2 fingertips on the index and middle finger that were present but very much in question. She worked. She lost track of time the way she always lost track of time when her hands were doing the thing her hands were built for. The OR-adjacent trauma repair that required the specific combination of speed and delicacy that most physicians could do one of and very few could do both. She debrided and irrigated and repaired in layers with Sandra managing fluid replacement and Paulson calling vitals with the steady, unhurried rhythm of someone who had decided to be exactly where he was needed and nothing more, which was the best version of Gerald Paulson she had encountered yet. 2 hours and 17 minutes. Carl Begich had all 10 fingers, a repaired nerve sheath, and a vascular integrity that would need specialist follow-up in Anchorage, but would almost certainly give him back full function. Not certainly. Almost. She was honest about that margin when she spoke to his wife on the phone at 4:30 in the morning, because honesty was what people actually needed when they were afraid. And false certainty was a kindness that turned into a cruelty the moment reality disagreed with it. She stripped her gloves off in the scrub room and stood at the sink with the water running cold over her wrists, and she stared at the drain. Paulson came in. He stood beside her at the adjacent sink and ran his own water, and they were both quiet for a moment. "The nerve sheath repair," he said. "That was microsurgical technique." "Close enough." "Where did you learn that in a trauma context?" "New Haven. We had a hand surgeon who moonlighted in the trauma bay twice a month. I watched him for 2 years, and then I asked him to teach me, and he did." She turned off the water. "It's not standard, but it's not magic either." Paulson dried his hands. He was looking at the wall above the sink. "I looked up your outcomes data this week," he said. "From New Haven, the 2018 cohort study, and the 2020 penetrating trauma series." She waited. "Your 30-day mortality rates were 14% below the national benchmark for comparable facilities." He folded the paper towel, put it in the bin. "That doesn't happen by accident." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." He looked at her then, directly for the first time since she'd arrived without the evaluation and skepticism compound in his eyes. Just looked at her the way one physician looks at another when they are being honest about competence. "I owe you an apology for the first week." "You don't." "I do. I was protecting my territory instead of thinking about the patients." He said it cleanly, without excessive performance of remorse, which she respected more than dramatics would have deserved. "It won't happen again." "I know it won't," she said, "because I'm not going anywhere." He almost smiled. Not quite. Close enough. The snowstorm arrived 3 days later, and it arrived with the complete commitment of an Alaskan winter that has been patient long enough. The facility went to storm protocol at 6 in the evening. Non-emergency flights grounded, supply lines frozen, communication channels reduced to the satellite system, and the HF radio that Luis Vega maintained with the devoted attention of someone who understood that it was the difference between connected and completely alone. The staff rotation was compressed to whoever was physically present, which was Claire, Mercer, Sandra, Luis, and a community health aide named Joseph Evan, who had come in for a supply pickup and been politely informed by the weather that he was staying. They ate dinner together in the common room, packaged food, good coffee, the specific camaraderie of people locked in together by circumstances larger than any of them. Joseph Evan told a story about a previous storm that went on for 11 days and involved a breech birth, 2 cardiac events, and a dispute about a generator that became briefly physical. And the story was funny in the way that genuinely alarming experiences become funny at sufficient distance. Mercer was quiet through most of dinner. Claire was aware of him being quiet the way she was now aware of most things he did. Not as surveillance, more like the ambient awareness of a person whose frequencies you had begun to learn. After dinner, when the others had dispersed to quarters or the common room television, she found him in the equipment bay doing inventory checks that didn't strictly need to be done at 8:30 in the evening. "You're hiding," she said. He looked up from the equipment case. "I'm doing inventory." "At 8:30, during a storm, when we did full inventory on Monday." She leaned against the doorframe. "You're hiding." He closed the case, straightened up. The conversation in the plane, "I know. I need you to understand something," he said. He turned to face her fully, and whatever he'd been doing with his expression for the past 3 days, the managed neutral, the controlled surface, he had stopped doing it now. His face looked tired in the way of someone who has been holding something effortful for a long time. "I didn't recruit you to... This wasn't about..." He stopped, pressed his lips together, tried again. "I'm your supervisor. You're 3 weeks into a return to practice in a high-risk environment. Whatever happened on Route 14, whatever the connection is between that night and the fact that we're both standing here, I need you to know that I am aware of how this looks, and I would not, Rowan." She said his name the same way she had in the plane. Plain, exact, stopping him again. "I know." He looked at her. "I know you're not. I know the difference between a man who engineers a situation for his own benefit and a man who spent 19 years wondering if someone was okay and made one phone call to find out." She held his gaze. "I'm a woman who spent 10 years married to the first kind. I know the difference." Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly. More like a man setting down something heavy that he'd been insisting wasn't heavy. "What do we do with it?" he said. "Nothing right now. We do the job. We be exactly what we are to each other in this facility, which is colleagues who are building mutual professional respect in a high-stakes environment." She pushed off from the doorframe. "And we let the rest of it exist without forcing it into a shape before it's ready." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's unusually measured for someone who just had a 19-year revelation dropped on her." "I had 4 years of marriage therapy," she said. "I got very good at measured. Also, I'm extremely tired, and the storm makes thinking feel like more work than it's worth." She turned to go. "Good night, Rowan." "Good night, Claire." She walked down the corridor toward her quarters, and she was almost at the door when the satellite phone at the nurse's station rang with the triple pattern that meant it was the external administrative line, not a medical call. She stopped. Sandra answered it from the common room doorway. Claire watched Sandra's face change. Not dramatically, more the way a face changes when it receives information it needs to process before it can respond to. Sandra held the phone out toward her. "It's for you," she said. "New York area code." Claire crossed back to the station and took the phone. "This is Dr. Monroe." The voice on the other end was a woman's. Composed, polished, containing underneath its composure a specific vibration that Claire recognized as the sound of someone doing something they had decided to do before they lost the nerve to do it. "Dr. Monroe? My name is Vivienne Hartley." A pause. "I think you know who I am." The station hallway was very quiet. The storm pressed at the walls. Claire gripped the phone and kept her face as still as she knew how to make it and said, "I know who you are. I'm calling because Adrian is in the hospital," Vivienne said. "He's been admitted. Chest pain. They're running a cardiac workup and they're not..." Her voice cracked once, precisely once, and then she sealed it back up with visible effort. They're not certain yet what they're looking at. He's been asking for you. Not for me. For you. Another pause, longer this time. I thought you should know. Claire stood in the hallway of a medical facility at the edge of the world with a storm tearing at the roof overhead and the phone cold against her ear, and she felt the ground beneath her shift, and the way it shifts when the story you thought you were living turns out to have a chapter you hadn't read yet, and the chapter had teeth, and the choice it was handing her right now would cost something regardless of which way she turned. Because going back to New York meant walking back toward everything she had just survived walking away from, and not going back meant making a decision about who she was and what she owed, and where the line was between freedom and the kind of coldness that hollows a person out from the inside. She breathed in. She breathed out. Tell me his current vitals, she said. Vivienne read the vitals from a piece of paper. Her voice stayed composed while she did it. BP 142/91, heart rate 108, troponin elevated at 0.6 on first draw, repeat draw pending. EKG showing ST changes in leads 2, 3, and a VF. She read them the way someone reads who has been sitting in a cardiac unit for 4 hours memorizing numbers because memorizing numbers was the only useful thing available to her. Claire listened, and her brain did what her brain always did with clinical information. Sorted it, weighted it, began building probability trees without being asked to. Inferior wall. Possibly right ventricular involvement depending on the right-sided leads they may or may not have thought to run. Troponin of 0.6 on first draw with ST changes in that distribution was not a question mark. It was an answer. Who's his attending? She said. Dr. Ferris, Mount Sinai. Is Ferris interventional? I don't know. Find out. Before you hang up, find out if Ferris is interventional cardiology or general. If he's general, you need to ask specifically whether a cath lab has been activated. She paused. Don't ask. Tell them you're requesting confirmation that the interventional team has been contacted. Use that exact language. Silence on the line. Then, why does that matter? Why? Because inferior MMY with possible RV involvement has a narrow window for intervention that determines long-term cardiac function. If they're still in workup mode and haven't activated the cath lab, every minute of that conversation is a minute of myocardium dying. She kept her voice clinical. Not cold. Clinical. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. He needs to be in that lab. If Ferris is dragging his feet for any reason, Adrian needs an advocate in that room who knows what to ask for. A longer silence. When Vivienne spoke again, the composed surface had developed a crack in it that was entirely human and entirely understandable. Will you come? Claire looked down the corridor toward the equipment bay. Through the small window at the end, she could see the storm, the snow moving sideways, dense and absolute, erasing the landscape. Flights are grounded, she said. I'm in storm lockdown. The earliest I can get out is tomorrow morning if the weather breaks. I know. Vivienne stopped. He keeps saying your name, not to me. To the nurses. He told them his emergency contact was still his wife, and they came to get me, and he looked at me and said he meant his actual wife. The crack widened slightly. I don't know what to do with that. Get him into the cath lab, Claire said. That's what you do with it right now. Everything else is secondary. She hung up. She stood at the nurse's station for a moment with her hand still on the phone. The satellite unit hummed beneath her palm. The storm pushed at the building with the patient, remorseless pressure of something that had decided to be exactly what it was and had no interest in being reasoned with. Mercer was standing at the end of the corridor. She didn't know how long he had been there, long enough to have heard the shape of the conversation, probably, even if not every word. He wasn't pretending he hadn't been there. He met her eyes directly and waited. My ex-husband is in a cardiac unit in New York, she said. Probable inferior MI. His expression didn't change. Not with surprise, not with anything that would have made the situation about him. How bad? Bad enough. Elevated troponin, inferior ST changes, window for intervention is closing, she breathed. I can't get out until the storm breaks. Probably 6 in the morning if the pressure system moves the way Frank thinks it will. I know. Do you need to go? She looked at him. The question was plain, not weighted with anything other than the actual question. Do you need to go? And if you do, We will figure out the coverage, and that is the only thing I'm asking. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He nodded once. Let me know when you do. He went back toward the equipment bay and left her alone in the corridor with the storm and the humming satellite phone and a decision that was not yet fully formed but was already costing her something in the making of it. She went to her quarters and sat on the bunk and called Dana. Dana picked up on the first ring, which meant she was already awake, which meant she already knew. Vivienne called you too, Claire said. She called me looking for your Alaska number. Dana's voice was careful in the way it got when Dana was working hard to present information without editorializing it. I gave it to her. I'm sorry if... No, you did right. Claire leaned back against the wall. The bunk frame was cold through her shirt. Tell me what you know. He collapsed at the office, around 6 this evening. His clerk called 911. By the time he got to Sinai, his pressure was tanking, and they had him in the unit within the hour. Dana paused. Claire, the clerk said he'd been having chest discomfort for 2 days and didn't tell anyone. 2 days. She closed her eyes briefly. 2 days of symptoms, Adrian Holloway doing the thing he always did, which was decide that acknowledging a vulnerability was more dangerous than the vulnerability itself. He's an idiot, she said. Yes. He's always been an idiot about his own body. Yes. Do you know if Ferris activated the cath lab? As of 40 minutes ago, yes. They went in an hour ago. I'm waiting on word. Dana was quiet for a moment. Are you coming back? The question was the same as Mercer's and completely different from it. I don't know, Claire said. Can I say the thing I'm thinking? If you have to. You are not responsible for him, Dana said. Quietly, precisely. The way she said things she had been holding for a long time. You signed those papers, you walked out of that apartment, you flew to the end of the world and you rebuilt yourself from nothing, and you don't owe him. I know that. Then why are you considering it? Claire was quiet for a moment. Outside her small window, the storm was a white wall, total and indifferent. Because knowing I don't owe him something and deciding not to do it anyway are two different things, she said. And I've spent enough time in this job watching people die from things that were preventable to know that I cannot sit in Alaska and make his medical decisions by satellite phone and sleep easily if it goes wrong. She pressed her hand flat against the cold wall beside the bunk. This isn't about him, Dana. It's about who I am. Silence on the line. I know, Dana said finally. I know that. I just needed to make sure you knew it too. I do. Call me when you land. The storm broke at 5:47 in the morning. Frank Dillard had the plane checked and ready by 6:15 with the specific efficiency of a man who had been told there was a medical situation and had decided that being ready was his contribution to it. Claire was at the airstrip with one bag at 6:10, and Mercer was there too, which she hadn't expected. He handed her a coffee from the facility thermos. She took it. They stood in the early light, which at this hour in February was a gray-blue that was more atmospheric than illuminating, and the cold had the post-storm quality of something that had spent itself and was now simply cold. Adrian's cath came back, she said. Dana texted at 4. They stented a proximal RCA occlusion. He's stable, out of immediate danger. Good. So I'm not going because he's dying. She wrapped both hands around the thermos cup. I'm going because there's a medical conference in New York, the Trauma and Emergency Medicine Summit, and I was invited to present 3 weeks ago, and I said no, and I'm going to call them this morning and say yes. She looked at him. And because I need to have a conversation with Adrian that I've been putting off for longer than I can justify. Mercer looked at her steadily. The early light did nothing flattering for anyone, and he looked exactly like himself in it, which she had come to understand was its own form of reliability. How long? He said. 4 days? 5 at most. Paulson can cover. Sandra will make sure he doesn't panic forward on anything significant. A pause. The conference. Are you presenting on the outcomes data? On field trauma decision-making in resource-limited environments? She almost smiled. I've been writing it in my head for 6 weeks. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile either. Something that was the precursor to one. They won't know what hit them. Frank appeared at the plane door and made a gesture that was universal across all cultures for, let's go now, please. She picked up her bag. She was 3 steps toward the plane when Mercer said her name. She turned. Come back, he said. Simple. Direct. No decoration on it. She held his gaze for a moment. I'll be back in 5 days. I know you will. A beat. I meant in general, keep coming back. The gray-blue light sat between them, and the cold was absolute, and the plane engine was warming up with a sound that meant time was a factor. And she looked at Rowan Mercer, the man who had stayed beside her on a road in October 19 years ago, and told her about a fishing boat and talked her back from the edge of shock. And she felt something inside her chest settle into a place it had been trying to find for a very long time. "Yes," she said. "I will." She got on the plane. New York in February looked exactly like New York always looked in February, which was beautiful and aggressively indifferent and completely unbothered by whatever any individual human being was going through. The cab from JFK moved through the familiar geometry of the city with the particular stop-start rhythm that Claire had spent 10 years learning to breathe through, and she sat in the back and watched the buildings go past and felt the strangeness of return. Not nostalgia, not grief, something more neutral than either. The city didn't know she'd been gone. The city didn't particularly care that she was back. She checked into a hotel in Midtown, her own hotel, her own credit card, her own name, and called the conference organizers and said she was available to present, and they responded with the barely contained enthusiasm of people who had wanted her on the program and were too professional to admit they'd been hoping she'd change her mind. She did not go to the hospital, not that night. Adrienne was stable, was being monitored, was in no danger, and arriving at the hospital that night would have been about her anxiety management rather than his medical need, and she had enough self-knowledge at this point to distinguish between the two. She ordered room service. She worked on her presentation. She slept 7 hours for the first time in weeks. The conference was held at the Javits Center, which was the kind of venue that made medicine feel simultaneously important and slightly corporate. And the main auditorium seated 400 people who had all spent years developing the specific posture of accomplished physicians in a professional setting, relaxed enough to signal confidence, upright enough to signal engagement. Claire stood backstage for 3 minutes before she walked out. 3 minutes of standing alone with her heartbeat in her ears and her presentation slides on the screen behind her, and the particular quality of silence that exists just before a large room becomes aware of you. She had been on stages before. Grand rounds, department presentations, the occasional conference in the years before Alaska became her life. But this was different. This was the first time she was walking onto a stage as the full version of herself, not the edited one, not the version that had shrunk to fit inside someone else's architecture. She walked out. The room looked back at her, 400 faces. She opened her mouth and she spoke. She spoke for 51 minutes about field trauma decision-making in environments with no imaging, no blood bank, no backup, and no ability to transfer the patient until the weather agreed to it. She spoke about the specific cognitive demands of operating outside protocol when protocol doesn't fit the situation, and about the difference between deviation driven by arrogance and deviation driven by clinical reasoning that has internalized the protocol deeply enough to know when it fails. She spoke about Mary Tunachuk and Twin B's decelerating heart rate and the 14 minutes between identifying fetal distress and getting the helicopter on the ground. And she spoke about Carl Begich's tendons and what a chainsaw does to the median nerve and what can be recovered with the right technique and the right timing and someone who refuses to look at the damage and decide it's too much. She spoke about what it costs a physician to stop practicing. She spoke about it plainly, without performance, with the specific authority of someone who has paid that cost personally and can therefore describe it accurately. When she finished, the room was quiet for 1 full second. Then it stood up, not politely, not the kind of applause that is socially obligatory in a professional setting, the kind that happens when a room full of people who have trained themselves to evaluate things critically evaluates something and decides, without coordination, that it deserves to be recognized. She stood at the podium and looked at 400 people standing, and she thought, there you are. There she was. Dr. Claire Monroe, trauma physician, 41 years old, 3 months out of a marriage that had cost her a decade and one step into a life that was entirely, terrifyingly, exhilaratingly her own. He was waiting in the lobby of the Javits Center. She saw him before he saw her, which gave her approximately 4 seconds to register his presence and decide how she was going to be in it, which was 4 seconds more than she'd had the morning he put divorce papers on the marble counter. Adrian Holloway looked like a man who had recently had a wire threaded through his femoral artery to place a stent in his coronary circulation, which is to say, he looked diminished in the specific way that serious illness diminishes people who have spent their lives using physical confidence as a social instrument. He was thinner. His color was off. He was standing with slightly less certainty than he used to stand with, and Claire registered all of this clinically. and then registered it as a human being and found that the two registrations did not cancel each other out. She could see that he was diminished and feel the appropriate concern for a person's health, and still not feel the undertow of guilt or responsibility that used to pull at her whenever Adrian was in difficulty. That was new. That was hard won. She noted it. He saw her when she was 10 feet away. Claire. He said her name the way you say something you've been rehearsing and are now suddenly uncertain about. You were... He gestured back toward the auditorium. I watched from the back. I got discharged this morning, and He stopped. You were extraordinary. You shouldn't be out of bed. I know. Adrian, you had a proximal RCA occlusion 48 hours ago. Being at the Javits Center is medically inadvisable. I know that too. He looked at her. His eyes were the same as they had always been. Intelligent, careful, always calculating. But something behind them had changed, or maybe cracked, in the specific way that near-death experiences crack the things people use to protect themselves from honesty. I needed to see you. I'm not here to ask for anything. I just needed to see you be that. He gestured again toward the auditorium, imprecise. A man for whom words were usually weapons, and who currently couldn't find a weapon that fit. I spent 10 years watching you make yourself smaller, and I told myself it was what you wanted, and I knew it wasn't, and I let myself believe the easier thing because the harder thing cost me too much. His jaw moved. I need you to know that I know that. The lobby was moving around them, conference attendees, caterers, the ambient noise of a large building in use, and they stood in the middle of it like two people in a pocket of suspended time. I know you know it, she said. He looked almost surprised. I've known for a while that you knew, she said. The not knowing was never really the problem, Adrian. The problem was that knowing didn't change the behavior. Knowing something is wrong and doing it anyway because it's convenient isn't ignorance, it's a choice. She kept her voice even. She wasn't angry. She had been angry. She'd been furiously, legitimately angry at 30,000 feet over the Rockies on the flight to Anchorage, alone with 3 bags and a decade of accumulated silences. But she wasn't angry now. She was clear. Clarity was better than anger. Clarity lasted. You chose it repeatedly, and I chose to stay and accept it, which is my part of it, and I'm not absolving myself of that. Claire, I forgive you, she said. He stopped. Not because you've earned it, not because this conversation is sufficient. I forgive you because carrying it is finished for me, and the forgiveness is mine to give or keep, and I'm choosing to give it because I don't want it anymore. She held his eyes. That's not a reconciliation. That's not an opening. That's just the truth of where I am. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched something move through his face. Grief, probably. The real kind. Not the performed kind. The kind that arrives when a person understands finally and completely that a door is closed and will not reopen, and the closing is appropriate and deserved. Are you happy? He said, quietly, like he genuinely needed to know. She thought about Alaska, about the cold and the terrible coffee, and Carl Begic's tendons and Mary Tunichuk's twins, and a bush plane grounded on a gravel strip, and a man who told a 17-year-old girl about a fishing boat at the worst moment of her life. I'm becoming it, she said. That's better than happy. Happy is a state. Becoming is a direction. She picked up her bag from the floor beside her, and that was the moment Rowan Mercer walked through the lobby doors. She hadn't known he was coming. He hadn't told her he was coming. He was in his own jacket, city wrong, like her Alaskan gear had been airport wrong 3 months ago. His face carrying the particular expression of a man who has made a decision and has arrived to stand by it. He saw her across the lobby. He saw Adrian beside her. He stopped. He didn't move toward her. He didn't make the situation about himself. He stood where he was and met her eyes, and his expression said, I'm here if you want me here. It said, you don't need me to do anything. It said all of it without a word because he had never once wasted words. Adrian looked at him, then back at Claire. Something crossed Adrian's face that was recognition, not of Rowan specifically, but of what Rowan represented, which was the answer to a question Adrian had not known he was afraid of. He saw a man standing in a lobby in the wrong jacket who had apparently flown from Alaska to stand quietly in a doorway, and he understood immediately and completely what that cost and what it meant and why it was different from anything Adrian himself had ever offered. Go, Adrian said, quietly. without bitterness, like a man clearing his own debt. Claire looked at him one last time. "Take care of yourself," she said. "Follow up with your cardiologist in 2 weeks. Cardiac rehab starts within 30 days of the procedure. Don't skip it because you think you're too busy." "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She walked across the lobby toward Rowan, and with each step she felt the 10 years compact into something that was not heavier than she could carry, but was exactly as heavy as it should be. Present, acknowledged, no longer running alongside her like an open wound demanding attention. Rowan watched her come. His face did the thing that wasn't quite a smile, but was the shape of one. "You weren't supposed to come," she said when she reached him. "I know. You have cases. You have Paulson panicking forward and Sandra managing everything, and Paulson is fine. Sandra has everything." He looked at her. "How'd the presentation go?" Standing ovation. His expression completed the smile it had been moving toward. "Obviously." She looked up at him. "You flew from Anchorage." "Fairbanks, actually. Caught a connection." "Rowan, that's a 7-hour... I wanted to see you on that stage." His voice was quiet. Plain. The way it always was when he meant something the most. "I've spent 19 years wondering if the girl on Route 14 was okay. I wanted to see the answer in the same room as the question." He paused. She was more than okay. The lobby noise moved around them, and the city existed outside the glass walls doing what cities do, and Claire Monroe stood in the middle of it with the full weight of everything she had survived and rebuilt and reclaimed, and she looked at the man who had stayed beside her at the worst moment of her life before either of them knew that was what they were doing, and she felt the last thing inside her that had been held at a careful distance finally release its grip and move toward something warmer. She reached out and took his hand. Not dramatically, not as a statement, just took it, the way you take something that has been available to you for a while and you have finally decided you are ready to hold. His hand closed around hers. "We should go back," she said. "When you're ready. I'm ready now." She looked at him steadily. "But there's something I need to tell you first. Something about the conference. They offered me a position, International Trauma Outreach Coordinator. It would mean traveling. It would mean building something new." She watched his face. "It would mean asking you what you think about that." He looked at her for a long moment. "Tell me what the position entails," he said. And she started talking, and he listened the way he always listened. Completely, without interruption, without making it smaller. And outside the February city went about its cold and indifferent business, entirely unaware that inside a convention center lobby, two people who had found each other twice were deciding, with open eyes and no illusions, to find each other a third time and keep what they'd found. But before she could finish telling him what the position entailed, her phone rang. Sandra's number. She felt Rowan's hand tighten slightly on hers before he released it, and she answered, and Sandra's voice on the other end had the particular quality, controlled, fast, precise, that meant something had happened in Alaska that could not wait for anyone to be ready for it. Sandra's voice had no preamble. "We have a situation. Joseph Evan, the community health aide who was stranded here during the storm. He had a syncopal episode 40 minutes ago, came around, but his pressure's 80/50 and dropping, abdomen's rigid, he's diaphoretic, and he looks gray, Claire. He looks really gray." A breath, fast and controlled. "Paulson thinks ruptured AAA. I think Paulson's right. We have no vascular surgeon, no OR, no blood bank. We have 4 units of O negative in the emergency reserve and a satellite link to Fairbanks that keeps cutting out." Claire had already turned away from Rowan. Her brain had already left the lobby. "How old is he?" 62. BP trend? Was 90 palp on first check. 80 systolic now, dropping maybe 2 to 3 points every 10 minutes. "What's your evacuation window?" "That's the problem. There's a system moving back in. Frank says he can get a bird in the air in the next 40 minutes, or it closes for minimum 6 hours. Sandra's voice tightened by 1 precise degree. 6 hours, Claire. The math was immediate and merciless. A ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm with a systolic pressure of 80 and dropping did not survive 6 hours of conservative management in a facility with 4 units of packed red cells and no surgical capability. The math said that clearly and without negotiation. "Put Paulson on," she said. A shuffle. Then Paulson's voice, clipped and focused in a way she hadn't heard from him before. The version of Gerald Paulson that existed underneath the territorial rigidity. The one that had apparently been there all along waiting for a situation serious enough to require it. I've got 2 large bore IVs, fluids running wide open, first unit of O negative up, he said. He's conscious, oriented, cooperative, says he's had back pain for 2 weeks that he thought was muscular. 2 weeks of back pain in a 62-year-old male. Did anyone image him during the storm? He didn't mention it. Of course he didn't. Nobody mentioned it until the thing rupturing made it impossible to ignore. Okay, listen to me. Permissive hypotension. Pull the fluids back. Target systolic of 70 to 80, not higher. You push his pressure up, you accelerate the bleeding. I know permissive hypotension. I know you know it. I'm saying it out loud, so we're both saying the same thing at the same time, and nobody makes a different call while I'm in New York. She started moving toward the lobby exit. Rowan was beside her, already moving without being told. You have 40 minutes to get him on that plane. If the window closes before he's stable enough to fly, call me back immediately, and we talk about what's next. But get him on that plane, Gerald. What if he crashes in the air? He will definitely die in 6 hours on the ground. He has a chance in the air. She pushed through the lobby door into the February cold. Frank knows how to fly fast. Get him on the plane. Okay. A pause that lasted less than a second. Okay. Going. The line stayed open. She could hear the background, saw movement, equipment, Paulson's voice redirecting to Sandra, Sandra's response. The particular orchestrated urgency of a small medical team that has a problem larger than its resources and has decided to be larger than the problem. Rowan had his phone out. She heard him talking to someone, airline, she registered peripherally, while she stood on the sidewalk outside the Javits Center in the February cold with the phone pressed to her ear and her brain 3,000 miles away in an Alaskan facility doing triage on a situation she could not physically touch. This was the particular hell of remote medicine that nobody talked about in the conference presentations. Not the resource limitations or the weather or the isolation. The specific hell of knowing exactly what needed to be done and being in the wrong place to do it and having to trust other people to do it well enough while you stood on a sidewalk in New York City and listened. She trusted Paulson. She trusted Sandra. She had not always trusted them, and now she did, and the trust was not comfort. Trust in a crisis is not comfort. It is a different kind of weight, the weight of something you have decided to put down and cannot pick back up. And she stood with that weight and listened to her team work. 31 minutes later, Sandra's voice. He's on the plane. Claire let out a breath that she had not been fully aware of holding. BP on boarding? 78 systolic, he's conscious. Paulson's flying with him. Good. Paulson's flying with him. Paulson insisted. A pause that contained something almost like warmth. He wouldn't let Frank take off without him. Gerald Paulson, who had given Claire a look full of territorial skepticism on her first day, who had spent 19 years building a practice out of protocols precisely because protocols made the uncontrollable feel manageable, was currently in a bush plane over Alaska with a 62-year-old man who was bleeding internally, running permissive hypotension and counting minutes, because the patient needed him, and he knew it, and he went. She stood on the sidewalk and felt something shift in her chest that was not about Joseph Evans specifically, and was about all of it. The whole improbable architecture of the last 4 months. The way people surprised you if you stayed long enough and demanded enough and showed them the version of themselves that was capable of rising to what the situation required. Call me when he's in Fairbanks, she said. I will. She hung up. Rowan was standing beside her. He'd put his phone away. He was looking at her with the expression she had learned, the real version of his face, the one underneath the managed neutral. He's on the plane, she said. I heard. He paused. I got us on the first flight to Anchorage, leaves in 3 hours. She looked at him. You were going to ask, he said simply. She was. She had been about to ask exactly that. She looked at him standing in the February cold in his wrong for the city jacket, and she thought about a 17-year-old boy who stayed beside a stranger on a road in October because leaving had not occurred to him as an option, and she understood that this was not a character he had built or a decision he made situationally. It was just what he was. It had always been what he was. Yes, she said. Okay, 3 hours. They walked together toward the street to find a cab, and the city moved around them with its complete indifference, and she did not look back at the Javits Center. Joseph Evans survived. He made it to the Fairbanks surgical suite with a systolic of 64, which was the lowest pressure compatible with consciousness in a man his size with his physiology, and the vascular surgeon who opened him found a contained retroperitoneal rupture that had been bleeding slowly for, the surgeon's estimate, somewhere between 18 and 36 hours. Another 6 hours on the ground in Bethel would not have been survivable. The math had been correct. The math was always correct. That was the thing about medicine that never changed, regardless of how much you wished it would make exceptions. Paulson called Claire from the surgical waiting room at 1 in the morning, Fairbanks time. His voice had the quality of a man who has been running on adrenaline for 7 hours and has just now been given permission to stop. "He's out," Paulson said. "Surgeon says the repair went well. He'll be in ICU for 72 hours minimum, but the prognosis is..." He stopped. She could hear him working through something. "The surgeon said if we'd waited, he wouldn't have made the table. You got him there, Gerald." A silence. "We got him there." She let that stand. "Get some sleep," she said. "You can't drive a rental car on this much adrenaline, and I will not be responsible for you becoming a patient in the same facility." He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him. "Yes, Dr. Monroe." "Good night." She set the phone down and leaned back in the hotel chair. They had taken a different hotel, 2 rooms, no discussion required about that. And she looked at the ceiling of a Fairbanks hotel room at 1 in the morning and felt the full length of the last 24 hours settle over her like something enormous and survivable. There was a knock on the connecting wall, not the door, the wall. Rowan's room was adjacent. "I heard you hang up," his voice came through, muffled but clear. "He's okay?" "He's okay." "Good." Pause. "Get some sleep." "You too." She slept. She was back in Bethel by noon the next day. The facility smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, and the faint ghost of the terrible common room coffee, and she stood in the entrance for a moment after the door closed behind her and let it land. The specific sensation of returning to a place that has become, without your fully deciding it, the place you are from. Sandra was at the nurse's station. "Welcome back," Sandra said without looking up from the chart she was annotating. "Thank you." "Joseph's wife called this morning. She wanted me to tell you," I'm quoting directly, "that she intends to bring you the best smoked salmon you have ever tasted as soon as her husband is well enough to fish again." "Tell her that's not necessary." I told her that. She said, and again I'm quoting, that she wasn't asking. Sandra looked up. Her eyes were tired and sharp and warm, in the way they were when she had been running a facility short-handed and was too competent to complain about it. "Paulson gets back tomorrow." "Good. He called me from Fairbanks. He said..." Sandra paused, choosing. "He said he understood now what you meant about deviation from protocol needing to be defended in real time. He said the permissive hypotension call made sense when you explained the reasoning, and he wouldn't have made it confidently on his own. That was the most significant thing Gerald Paulson had said since she'd arrived, and he'd said it to Sandra in a waiting room in Fairbanks at 1 in the morning, which was exactly the right place and the right time for a man like him to say something like that. "He did good work," Claire said. "He did very good work." Sandra looked back at her chart. "Dr. Mercer is in the equipment bay." She found him doing the inventory he had been doing when she'd called him hiding 3 weeks ago, which was apparently something he did when he was thinking. He looked up when she came in. His face settled into the expression she now knew was his version of relief. Controlled, quiet, present. "Everything's in order here," she said. "I know, Sandra ran the facility perfectly." He closed the equipment case. "How are you?" The question was simple, and she took it seriously. She stopped, considered. "I'm oriented," is the word. "I know where I am and why I'm here and what I'm doing." She looked at him directly. "That's new. In the best way." He nodded. The conference position. She had told him on the plane what the offer entailed. The international trauma outreach coordinator role, the global programming, the travel. She had told him and watched his face, and he had listened, and she had seen him thinking, and she had not pushed him toward any particular response, because she had spent 10 years with a man who required her to pre-manage her ambitions before presenting them. And she was done with that architecture entirely. "I want to take it," she said. "It's a part-time administrative role. I can structure it around continued clinical work here. It doesn't have to be one or the other." She held his gaze. "But it changes things. Travel, extended periods away from the facility, more complexity." "Yes," he said. She waited. "Yes, take it," he said. "It's exactly the kind of work you should be doing. The field experience you've built here combined with the outcomes research background. There's nobody better positioned for it." He said it the way he said everything that he meant, plainly, without performance, with the specific weight of a person who has decided what he thinks and is not interested in making you negotiate for it. The facility will adapt. I'll adapt. She looked at him for a moment. You make it very hard to brace for a fight. Good. Adrian used to make me present my arguments in advance, like a legal brief. Here is what I want, and here is why it's reasonable, and here is why it shouldn't inconvenience you. She said it without heat, factual. I got so accustomed to it that I started doing it internally, pre-arguing with myself before I said anything. That sounds exhausting. It was. She exhaled slowly. I'm trying to stop. He crossed the equipment bay to where she was standing and stopped an arm's length away and looked at her with the directness that was simply how he was. No angle in it, no management. You don't have to pre-argue anything with me, he said. Tell me what you want. I'll tell you what I think. We'll figure it out from there. That's simple. That's simple. She looked up at him. She thought about the girl on Route 14 who had laughed at a story about a fishing boat in the worst moment of her life. Because the alternative was disappearing into the dark, and she had decided, without knowing she was deciding it, that she wasn't going to do that. She thought about the woman who had signed divorce papers on a Tuesday morning and gotten on a plane and rebuilt herself from the inside out in a facility at the edge of the world. She thought about what it had cost and what it had given, and the distance between the person she had been and the person standing in this equipment bay right now, and she found that the distance was not something she wanted to collapse or pretend was smaller than it was. It was the right size. It was exactly the size of everything she had survived to be here. Okay, she said. He reached out and tucked a piece of her hair back from her face. Just that. Nothing more. The kind of gesture that is not a declaration but is a statement, quiet and unambiguous. And she let him. And she felt the warmth of it travel through the cold she had been living inside for 4 months and begin, slowly, to find the places that were ready for it. Okay, he said. They married in October, not because October had significance, or perhaps because it did, in the way that the people involved understood, without needing to perform their understanding of it. The ceremony was in the facility common room, which Sandra had decorated with the restrained competence she brought to everything. And the guests were the people who had been there: Sandra, Luis Vega, Frank Dillard, Gerald Paulson, who stood in the back with his hands folded and his eyes brighter than usual, and Joseph Evan, 6 months post-repair, who had arrived with smoked salmon and a handshake for Rowan that turned into something closer to an embrace. Dana flew in from New York and sat in the front row and cried with the specific dignity of a woman who has been waiting for something for a very long time and is trying not to be obvious about how relieved she is that it finally arrived. There was no officiant of any religious variety. They had a justice of the peace from Bethel who had a firm handshake and the pragmatic warmth of someone who has officiated marriages in remote Alaska for 20 years and has a genuine appreciation for people who choose each other without illusions. Claire wore her own clothes, not a gown, a dress she had ordered online in the right shade of winter blue, and her own boots, proper ones now, the kind that had seen real cold and still looked like something. Rowan wore a jacket that fit him correctly, which Sandra had apparently enforced with some force, and he stood beside the justice of the peace with the expression he always had when something mattered to him, which was no expression at all on the surface and everything underneath it. When it was her turn to speak the words she had written herself, she looked at him and said them plainly, without ceremony, the way she had learned to say everything that was real. I spent a long time being smaller than I was supposed to be. I thought that was what love asked for. You showed me, without trying to show me anything, that the version of myself worth loving is the whole version. The doctor. The woman who argues about protocol. The person who needs to be right and knows when she's wrong and will tell you both. She felt her voice steady itself over the slight roughness of something genuine. I'm bringing all of it. I'm not leaving any of it at the door, and I'm asking you to do the same. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on a gravel strip in the early morning light when she was leaving for New York, with everything present in his face and nothing hidden and no performance of anything. I already am, he said. The pregnancy was not planned. She was 42, and the test in the facility bathroom on a Tuesday morning was an event she sat with alone for 20 minutes before she called anyone. Not because she was afraid, but because she needed to be the first person to know and to locate what she felt about it before the world got involved. What she felt, after 20 minutes of sitting on the cold tile floor with her back against the cabinet in a way that reminded her of another bathroom floor in another life, was something she did not have an immediate clean word for. It was large. It was frightening in the specific way that things are frightening when they are also exactly what you did not know you wanted. She told Rowan that evening. She handed him the test without preamble and watched his face. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Are you okay?" he said. "Yes." She meant it. "Are you?" He sat down on the edge of the bunk and looked at the test again, and she watched something move through his face that was not a single emotion but several, arriving in sequence: shock, and then something that was almost disbelief, and then underneath both of those, quiet and very real, something that looked like a man discovering that the life he had been building had more rooms in it than he knew. "Yes," he said. "I think I am." The complications began at 32 weeks. HELP syndrome, hemolysis, elevated liver enzymes, low platelets, is one of the cruelest presentations in obstetric medicine because it arrives in a pregnancy that has been progressing well, and it moves fast, and it does not negotiate. Claire recognized her own symptoms before anyone else did, which was the particular horror of being a physician who becomes a patient. You understand precisely what is happening to you, and you cannot unknow it. Her blood pressure was 158/102 at the morning check. Her platelet count on the stat lab was 87,000 and dropping. She had pain in her right upper quadrant that she had been calling muscle strain for 12 hours and knew now she had been wrong about, and she had the specific visual disturbance at the edges of her vision that meant the endothelium was losing the argument with a process that had decided to take everything it could take. She told Sandra first. Sandra looked at the numbers and looked at Claire and did the thing she always did, which was process and move without wasting time on feelings that could be felt later. "I'm calling Rowan." "I know." "And I'm calling Fairbanks for emergency transfer." "I know that too." "Claire," Sandra's voice dropped one register, not softer exactly, more direct. "You need to stop being the physician in this room and be the patient." That was the hardest sentence anyone had said to her in the entire year she had been in Alaska. She breathed through it. "Okay," she said. Rowan was in the trauma bay in 4 minutes. She watched him read the numbers on the chart Sandra handed him, and she watched his face go through the same sequence hers had gone through that morning. Recognition, and then understanding, and then the particular quality of fear that belongs to a person who knows enough to understand exactly what they're afraid of. He came to stand beside her. He took her hand. He did not tell her it was going to be fine. He did not make the kind of automatic reassurance that people make to manage their own anxiety at the expense of the other person's right to accurate information. He took her hand and held it and looked at her and said, "Tell me what you need." "I need magnesium sulfate, and I need to be in a surgical suite in Fairbanks within 90 minutes. Frank's already on the radio. If my pressure spikes above 160 systolic, I need labetalol IV. I need the dose calculated for my current weight, which is..." "Claire." His hand tightened on hers. Not hard, present. "I know the protocol." She stopped. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with his face completely open. No controlled surface, no managed neutral, nothing held back. Just Rowan, present and frightened and entirely, utterly there. "Let me be the doctor for this one," he said quietly. She closed her eyes for a moment. She felt the magnesium going in. Sandra had started it without being asked, because Sandra was Sandra, and the slight warmth of it moving through the IV and the weight of her own body against the gurney and the small movement inside her that was their daughter, still present, still there, conducting her own small argument for continuance. "Okay," Claire said. For the second time in her life on a gurney with Rowan Mercer standing beside her, she let someone else hold the weight of what came next. She reached up and gripped his hand the way Peter Tunachuk had gripped hers in a doorway in Akiachak. Full. Unguarded. He gripped back. Their daughter was born at 32 weeks and 4 days by emergency cesarean in Fairbanks, weighing 4 pounds and 1 ounce, breathing on her own from the first minute with the specific indignant determination of someone who has been inconvenienced and intends everyone to know it. Claire was in the ICU for 36 hours post-delivery, with her platelet count at its lowest point of 61,000 before the HELLP began to resolve, which it did, the way it does when the delivery removes the trigger and the body reassembles itself with the patient, methodical determination of a system that knows what it is supposed to do and simply needed the obstruction removed. Rowan sat beside her for all 36 hours. He slept in the chair. He ate from the vending machine in the hallway. He held the baby in the NICU and brought her to Claire when the nursing staff allowed it, and he sat with both of them in the specific silence of people who have been through something and are still inside it and are not pretending otherwise. On the second morning, Claire was alert enough to hold her daughter properly. Not the careful managed hold of someone attached to monitoring lines, but hold her, actually hold her, with both arms and her face close to the baby's face, and the specific gravity of that contact, which does not have an adequate clinical description and does not need one. The baby had dark eyes. She looked at Claire with the unfocused, absolute attention of a newborn, which is the most complete attention any human being will ever give another, before the world teaches them to look away. "Hi," Claire said quietly. Just that. The baby moved her mouth. Rowan was watching from the chair beside the bed, his elbows on his knees and his hands folded, and his face had the expression of a man at the exact center of his own life looking at it and recognizing it. "She looks like you," he said. "She looks like herself," Claire said. "She just got here. Give her a minute." He almost smiled. Then he did smile. The full version, rare and undefended, and she thought that she would remember this specific moment, this room, this light, this face, for the rest of her life with a clarity that had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with being entirely, finally, present for her own existence. They named her Eva, not for anyone, just the name which meant life and which seemed accurate. Years later, standing at a podium in front of an international medical audience at a conference in Geneva, Claire Monroe, Dr. Monroe, director of the Global Trauma Outreach Initiative, whose field programs now operated in 11 countries across 4 continents, said the things she had been learning how to say since she was 22 years old on a road in October. The most dangerous thing that can happen to a physician is not burnout. It's not resource limitation or systemic failure or the accumulation of loss, though all of those are real and all of them cost something. She looked at the room, 400 faces, different from the Javits Center audience and the same as it. The most dangerous thing is forgetting that the person doing the work is also a person, that your survival is not incidental to your effectiveness. It is the condition of it. She paused. You cannot give what you have extinguished in yourself. Take that seriously. The patients need you present, not depleted. They need the whole doctor, not the remains of one. In the front row, Rowan sat with Eva on one side of him, 7 years old now, already asking questions about the medicine her parents did that neither of them had yet found a way to fully answer without her requiring follow-up questions. And Dana Reyes on the other, who had flown from New York because she had been flying to wherever Claire was for 22 years and had no intention of stopping. Eva was watching her mother on the stage with the complete, unfiltered attention she had been watching her with since the first morning in the Fairbanks NICU. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stillness, and the particular quality of a child who has grown up among people who take things seriously and has absorbed the understanding that serious things are worth your full attention. When Claire finished and the applause began, Eva leaned toward Rowan and said, in the practical, slightly too loud voice of a 7-year-old with a question that will not wait, "Is that why you stayed with Mama on the road? Because she needed the whole doctor?" Rowan looked at his daughter for a moment. Outside the conference hall, Geneva was doing whatever Geneva did in the afternoon, entirely indifferent to the conversation happening inside, and the applause was washing over the room in the long, warm wave of 1,000 people responding to something true. "I wasn't a doctor then," he said. "I was just a kid who thought leaving wasn't the right thing to do." Eva considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. "But it worked out the same." "Yes," he said. "It did." On the stage, Claire stepped back from the podium. She found his face in the front row. She always found his face. It was a reflex now, as automatic as breathing. And she looked at him and at their daughter beside him and at Dana, who was wiping her eyes with the same dignity she had always managed to cry with. And she felt the full weight of everything she had built and survived and chosen, and it was heavy and right and entirely hers. She had signed divorce papers on a Tuesday morning in a kitchen that smelled like fresh coffee and something rotting underneath it. She had flown to the end of the world to find out if she still existed. She did. She walked off the stage into the arms of the people who loved her without conditions, without reductions, without asking her to be less than the entirety of herself. And the story did not end there because stories don't end. They find their level, they find their shape. They become the ground you stand on rather than the storm you're surviving. But if you were watching from the auditorium, from the front row, from the doorway where a 17-year-old boy had once stood and decided that leaving was not what the situation required, it would have looked, from any angle, unmistakably like a rival.